Hello, my name is Tim Malone, and I'm doing a series of lectures on American history. And today we're going to talk about the frontier thesis of American history and the frontier myth. And I want to emphasize that there's two things here, two things. There's the frontier thesis of American history. Also could call it the frontier theory of American history. And the second thing is the frontier myth. The frontier myth, which shows up in American literature, American cinema, American TV, American popular culture. The frontier myth. Now, about the frontier, remember that in the last lecture, at the end of the War of 1812, a lot of historians sort of make a metaphor that during the first 30 years of the history of the new nation, America had been preoccupied with European affairs. After the War of 1812, due to a number of reasons, that emphasis shifts. Europe is at peace. England is predominant. The Pax Britannica is beginning, the 100 years of peace under British colonial mastery. And the United States, metaphorically, turns from facing east towards Europe to facing west towards the territories that the United States had acquired west of the mountains, west of the Appalachian Mountains. Because the history of the United States is the history of westward settlement, westward movement, westward empire, westward conquest. The United States develops east to west. That's just a fact. It creates a mythical West. It creates a West that exists in people's minds and in our fiction. Now, the role of what you might call mythology in history is complicated. Remember, we talked about the Salem witch trials, and we talked about mass psychology and mass irrational psychology, and the appeal of scapegoating and the appeal of oversimplistic explanations for things. The West becomes sort of a magical land. The Western myth, that comes first. The frontier thesis of American history comes later, but has a tremendous impact on the telling of American history. Frederick Jackson Turner, he's the author of the frontier thesis of American history. 1896, 1892, he gives a paper at the Columbia Exposition in Chicago. That's 1892, isn't it? And the American Historical Association, Young American Historical Association, has a meeting at the exposition, and Turner presents a paper. Now, Turner's a history professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison at the time. He's from Wisconsin. He was born and raised in Portage, Wisconsin, which is right in the middle of the state, and which, when Turner was young in the 1840s and 1850s, was the frontier. Turner says he remembers Native Americans coming into town when he was a boy. And Turner's a smart chap, and he ends up at Harvard, Boston, study history. And he discovers at Harvard that in the 1880s, American history, it's in a formative stage, but isn't it always in a formative stage? That American history at Harvard was being taught pretty much as an extension of English history. The Harvard History Department was filled with Anglophiles, people who loved England, who thought of the United States as England Light. And American history was taught at that time as a subsidiary of English history. Still kind of a colonial mindset. Turner, being from Wisconsin, kind of rebelled against that. And Turner wanted to Americanize American history. Turner's thesis, the frontier thesis of American history, was an attempt by a Wisconsin boy to Americanize American history. American exceptionalism. Turner plays a big role in the idea of American exceptionalism. And what makes us special to Turner? The frontier, the West, the movement of American civilization, and boy, is that a fraught word. Have I talked about civilization yet in these lectures? What a sort of necessary but, whoa, problematic idea civilization is? Because Turner's definition of the frontier was the meeting point between savagery and civilization. Savagery. Back in the 1890s, you could still use that word to describe areas that hadn't been properly settled yet. You can't call Native Americans savages anymore. Thank God. But Turner still could in the 1890s. That's why Turner, boy, you know, when the civil rights movement comes along in the 1950s and 60s, and then Indian rights movement and women's rights movement, you know, that whole change, which we'll talk about at some point, that whole change, Turner goes into eclipse because Turner's frontier is, well, I don't know. See, if you said to Turner, you're a racist, he'd say, I am not. And it didn't seem like he was in his personal life. But the thesis is racist in that, at the very least, it ignores, does it? Native Americans. We'll come back to that, right? But why is America different than England? Why is it wrong to think of us as just an offshoot, a derivative of England? Because of this westward movement, because of this frontier, which Turner depicts as a line, north and south across the United States, that moves, and what direction does it move? West, right? West. And it's going to become the West. And I don't know what you people think when I say the West. The West. It has resonance in American history. But you're saying, well, so does the North, the South, and the East, right? I guess they all have resonance in American history as broad generalizations. But the West, this idea of the West, the existence of the West, this conception of a frontier that moves west, inevitably, according to Turner, right? Why did America develop the way it did? Turner says because of the existence of a frontier. Now he's writing in 1892, I believe, and Turner says in his paper that the census of 1890 had closed the frontier, that the frontier was gone, that and he says, thus ends the first great period of American history. See, Turner's periodizing too. And you know, his periodization is from the beginning, 1607, Jamestown, to 1890, when he says there's no longer a line. We reached California. Of course, we'd reached California earlier, but we'd filled in the gap. Now, of course, we continue to try to go west, right? There's going to be a Spanish-American War where we actually take control of the Philippines. Talk about further, what's so far west that it's east. But no, you know, you get over there, and there's Japan and China, and you know, they're not the Lakotas, right? I mean, so that's the end of that westward movement, right? Turner says, though, that scratch an American, find a frontiersman, right? And to this day, see, Turner's out of fashion. And I had history professors who wouldn't teach Turner or slough over him because his frontier thesis was imperialistic, colonial, in practice, in a lot of places, genocidal when it comes to Native Americans. Okay, I agree. Again, Turner seemed like a decent man himself, but you can't deny that Turner, for 70 years, 80 years, dominated American history. His thesis conquered American history. In that, well, they're called Turnerians, right? Followers of Turner. That the westward movement defines the American character. Here are some quotes from Frederick Jackson Turner. The frontier is the meeting point between savagery and civilization. American history, this is Turner, has been to a large degree the history of the colonization of the Great West. The existence of free land. Now, during the Civil War, Lincoln's Congress will pass the Homestead Act, which would give you 160 acres free if you settled it and improve it for a certain number of years. Before that, the land wasn't free. Turner says free land, it should be cheap land. Cheap. And free in certain areas, before the Homestead Act, free for squatters who pushed the frontier, right? You could get out beyond effective government control and blaze out some land and chop down trees and build a cabin and start growing corn. And in effect, then, the government will say, oh, okay. The existence of free land, its continuous recession, which direction? West, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. This is what Turner says. The existence of a frontier, the settlement of that frontier, explain American development. Whoa, that's the thesis. Scratch an American, find a cowboy. Well, we'll get to cowboys in a minute when we come back to the frontier myth. This continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society furnished the forces dominating the American character. Wow, the American character. We'll come back to that in a minute. But first off, let's say, is there such a thing as the American character? Turner thought so. And Turner thought that the American character came from where? The frontier. The frontier. Europeans came to America, immigrants, and they went out west, and that's where they became Americans. The frontier was an Americanization spot. America, where's America? On the frontier, out there at the meeting line between savagery and civilization. Now you can see by this quote that this continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society. So who's primitive society? Native Americans, right? The Native Americans play a role in Turner's thesis, but he doesn't concentrate on that. He doesn't make it explicit. What makes Americans different? Because they're part Indian. What makes American culture different? Native American influences. Well, how are we different from Europe? Native Americans. The influence of Native Americans. Now, we talked about that, Jack Weatherford's book. We talked about that when we talked about Native Americans a couple of lectures ago. The frontier provides this touchstone with primitive society. This intermixing creates Americans. That's what makes us American. So, the frontier myth. Well, no, let's stick with Turner a little bit longer here, right? Turner. Here are some more quotes from Frederick Jackson Turner. From the beginning of the settlement of America, the frontier regions have exercised a steady influence towards democracy. Holy smokes. Not only the American character is forged on the frontier, American democracy is forged on the frontier. Democracy comes from the frontier. This is interesting. I taught political science 101 a couple of times at Elgin Community College. Didn't like it, but I did it. And in a political science class, when you say democracy and you study the history of democracy, where do you go? You go to England. You go to the German forests. You go to ancient Athens, right? Democracy. Turner says, no. He says democracy was founded on the American frontier and was transported east to Europe. Turner, in effect, says that England, those monarchies in Europe, they don't teach us nothing about democracy or human rights. That's just a totally, to hell with that. Democracy is an American frontier phenomenon. That's where it starts. And I don't know about that. But there, he has evidence for that. Historically, the states and territories out west usually had the most democratic societies. They usually provided votes for more people. They usually, innovations like a recall, like what Gavin Newsom just went through, where's that at? California, out west. Illinois doesn't have recall. Democratic reforms, Turner's right. Democratic reforms have usually come from western states and territories. Women could first vote in Wyoming. He's right about that. That western areas have been more democratic. Here's another thing. The frontier meant the opportunity to destroy the bonds of social class. That's what Turner says. In other words, the frontier is anti-aristocratic. It's anti-aristocratic. And this sort of plays into the idea that the frontier is where you go to get a fresh start. If you're an immigrant in a ghetto, if you're a failed farmer in New England, where do you go for a second chance, for redemption? Out west. And on the frontier, it doesn't matter you're a duke or an earl or a prince. It doesn't matter what social class your family in New England was from. Now, that's what Turner says. Subsequently, there's been studies by historians that show that that's not really true. Out west, it mattered whether you had money or not. It mattered what your connections were back east to pots of money. It wasn't quite the leveling area that Turner made it out to be, that it did matter what social class you came from. But still, that idea, right? That idea caught on. Here's another quote. American democracy is fundamentally the outcome of the experiences of the American people in dealing with the West. Democracy came west. Oh, here's a good one. American democracy was not born of a theorist's dream. It came out of the American forest, and it gained strength each time it touched a new frontier. Not the Constitution, but free land out west made America a democracy. That's Turner. The West, free land. And again, free, more or less. Here's another aspect of the frontier according to Turner. The growth of nationalism and the evolution of American political institutions were dependent on the advance of the frontier. It was the nationalizing tendency of the West that transformed the democracy of Jefferson into the national republicanism of Monroe and the democracy of Jackson. Nationalism. According to Turner, there's 13 original states. All the other 37 are creatures of the federal government. The land was made national domain, the sale of which went to the national government. The frontier, the way the frontier was organized and settled, strengthened the national government, made America a nation. Nationalism, American nationalism, where did it come from? The frontier. American democracy, where did it come from? The frontier. The American character, where did it come from? The frontier. It was a pretty all-encompassing theory, the frontier thesis of American history. And again, the critics of Turner are right. And Turner's not considered politically correct anymore. But you can't ignore the influence he had on the story of American history. The frontier thesis, the legacies of it, are still evident in every American textbook, even those published today. William Cronin, a professor of history at University of Wisconsin-Madison, who occupies the Frederick Jackson Turner Chair of History at the University of Wisconsin. William Cronin, he wrote that famous book, Nature's Metropolis, about Chicago. Whoa, what a great book. William Cronin, I like what Cronin has said about Turner, because Cronin, is as politically correct as they come. And yet he says, you can't ignore Frederick Jackson Turner. You can't just say, well, he was a racist and an imperialist and a colonialist and a genocidal, his theory fostered genocidal tendencies. All may be true. But nevertheless, you can't ignore his influence on American history and American historiography. You got to confront Turner. And I don't know, you see, I don't know. I kind of like the idea that America generated democracy and human rights and republican government. I kind of like that, but again, it leads to notions of American exceptionalism that we're special, not just special, extra special. But nevertheless, I'm a bit of a Turnerian, just a bit. And I certainly agree with Cronin that you have to talk about him in American history. I mean, John Mack Farragher, who was the primary author of the textbook I used in my classes for years, title escapes me right now. John Mack Farragher, he in his textbooks, when he talked about this period, the westward turn and the westward movement, said that Frederick Jackson Turner, the most famous historian in our history. And you just can't eliminate Turner, because to me, I still see it here in 2021, the frontier thesis. Now, and even more so, the frontier myth. Now, the frontier myth is something special. The frontier thesis and the frontier myth, of course, coincide to a certain degree, but the frontier myth is something different. And, I've done this backwards in that the frontier myth preceded the frontier thesis. The frontier myth goes all the way back to the Puritans, not surprising, right? When they wrote these captivity narratives where some Puritan would get kidnapped or taken prisoner by the Native Americans and then held and then freed. I mean, the captivity narrative is a bit of a frontier myth, because it turns out that these frontier narratives are mostly made up. A lot of them are made up. It's fiction. The frontier myth and the frontier hero, right? When does that start? Well, it's there from the beginning, like I said, but a lot of historians talk about the 1820s and 1830s, this period we're talking about now, with the advent of the steam press, the mass producing of newspapers and pulp novels and broadsheets in the eastern cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, in the 1820s and 1830s. And there seems to be an insatiable appetite for Western stories. And of course, most of you are familiar with The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, the Leatherstocking series, which has persisted and been told many times. The most recent Last of the Mohicans, directed by Mann, with Daniel Day-Lewis as Hawkeye. I like that movie. Again, Turner lived in Western New York, which was not the frontier by the 1820s and 1830s. And he wrote about the Revolutionary period in his novels. But there seemed to be an insatiable appetite for Westerns. That's the term, right? Westerns. Now, when I was a kid, like when I was 10 years old, there were 25 Western series on network TV. 25 different Westerns on primetime network TV. Now there's none. There's none. The 50s and early 60s, well, all the way back, the first full-length movie, The Outlaws was it called, or The Train Robbers, was about a Western gang robbing a train. Classic trope, right? And again, I don't know how many of you know Westerns. I was raised with them everywhere. And it's interesting, let me repeat, now they're gone. Of course, students of literature and cinema and TV, they confront this question about what was going on post-World War II with this spate of Westerns, the cowboy, right? Cowboys and Indians. I don't want to get into too much of that right now here, but I raise it because talk about something you can see the legacy of today, the frontier myth. Now, of course, and the cowboy, right? Scratch an American, find a cowboy. And the code of the West. Now, let me just say about the Hollywoodization of the West and the Western, that the trope, that's an English literature term, the trope of two gunfighters at high noon, out there quick drawn, that my understanding is there is not a single historical example of that, like that, ever happening. Ever. That's a Hollywood creation. That's a myth. We're talking about the frontier myth. Now, the frontier myth isn't just out west, right? The frontier myth, that trope has been transferred to outer space. Space, the final frontier, right? William Shatner, Captain Kirk, is a cowboy in space. Not just that, the private detective, the noir genre. Sam Spade is a cowboy in the city. And that's very interesting that the dark back alleys of the city become the West. The meeting between savagery and civilization is some back alley in some huge metropolis. And Sam Spade or detectives Columbo, I don't know. They're cowboys. They're cowboys. Everybody's a cowboy? And again, that's the problem, cowboy, right? And Native Americans, and the myth of the Native American. There's this book, Hollywood Indians. I've never read it. I've read about it. I should. Hollywood Indians. Of course, Western, 1950s movie and TV Westerns, the Native Americans are all wrong. They're all wrong. And certainly that depiction of Native Americans in the frontier myth hasn't really done Native Americans any good, despite the fact that it provided jobs for some Native American actors. It really didn't do much to make Native American equal rights happen, to redress the crimes that were committed against them. Although ironic, and we talked about this when we talked about Native Americans, how positive the personal values of Native Americans are portrayed in these Westerns. It's oh, the poor Native Americans, they just have to go. Look at them, they never tell a lie. You know, they're loyal to their tribes. You know, you can count on Native Americans. But they gotta go, right? And that's Turner too, right? Turner. It's inevitable that civilization is going to roll what he calls savagery. Of course, that's not politically correct anymore. So let's see. The frontier myth, what's it about? The possibility of rebirth or redemption. A second chance out on the frontier. And boy, our Westerns are filled with that, right? On the frontier, you explore the limits of freedom. Freedom. That's where freedom is. Out there, and boy, you know, to this day, you know, we still, you know, have Americans who are, I want to go where I can be free. And, you know, I remember some years ago now reading a story about families in Alaska where the mother and the father and a couple of kids just walk into the Alaskan frontier to make it on their own. Oh, freedom. That's sort of the essence of American freedom. That's where, you know, that's part of the myth. The frontier myth. The cowboy, the drifter, even the wagon train, right, has no home. They blaze a trail into the unknown, into the wilderness. The wilderness, boy, that, talk about an anti-Native American concept. The wilderness, right? And of course, the wilderness has biblical implications, right? There's wildernesses in the Bible. Moses goes into the wilderness to get the Ten Commandments, and Jesus goes into the wilderness before he starts his public ministry, where he's tempted by the devil. The wilderness. I wonder if the devil was a Native American. I should ask the Puritans, right? He's the cowboy's a wanderer. I mean, what's the trope? The trope is after a Western, there's the conflict and the good guy wins. And then what does he do at the end of the Western? He rides into the sunset. He doesn't stay in the little town that he's cleaned the bad guys out of. No, he's off. And where does the sun set? The West. The West. The frontier mythological hero rides into the sunset, further west, towards more freedom, towards a second chance or a third chance. And of course, sort of the fourth point about the frontier myth, action, adventure, and violence. Richard Slotkin wrote a book about violence on the frontier, violence in the frontier myth. The American hero is violent. The American hero is a killer. The American hero is a man of action, continual action. Like we just said, he doesn't settle down. He rides off for more adventure, more action, more violence. It explains a lot about current America if you understand the frontier myth, in my opinion. It's morphed into many forms, but it's still there. So let's review the effects of the frontier on American history and American culture according to Turner's thesis. 1, it profoundly affects the development of the American character. The American character. Now, The American character is a controversial concept in and of itself. Is there such a thing as the American character? So then there's the Canadian character and the Mexican character and the French character and the English character. So every country has a character, or just the United States? The American character. And again, freedom-loving, democratic, nationalistic, violent. The American character. And here we get into, we talked about the myth, the frontier myth. This is sort of where the thesis and the myth come together in this idea of the American character. A frontier society, according to Turner, is inherently anti-class hierarchy. No aristocrats on the frontier. The frontier levels society. Everybody's equal on the frontier. Now again, there's been studies done that said, well, that wasn't true, but Turner posits it, and it's an important concept in the thesis. Equality is a frontier attribute. The frontier levels society. So the frontier is democratic by its nature. Because there's no class hierarchy, it's democratic, small d. Democracy. If you want to find the purest form of American democracy, you go to the frontier. That's according to Turner. And again, the modern idea of democracy. Forget Athens, right? According to Turner, it's founded, highlighted, and made a worldwide phenomenon growing out of the American forest, as he puts it. Democracy as a worldwide phenomenon. If you're going to teach the history of democracy, you go to the American frontier, according to Turner. Interesting. The frontier strengthens the federal government. Thus, the frontier is nationalistic. The frontier played a key role in the development of American nationalism. Now, we talked about nationalism, we talked about the American Revolution. What a concept, right? Perhaps the most important ism of them all, nationalism. But what is it? I struggle. And I've gone through periods where I've immersed myself in the literature about American nationalism, and it still kind of rocks me. What is nationalism? What does it take? Is it a naturally spontaneous occurring phenomenon, or is it built on purpose? That's one of the paradoxes, one of the conundrums about nationalism, just one. And Turner says that it's built, and it's built on the frontier. Wow. Again, very interesting idea. And Turner's out of fashion, but there's some evidence for the idea that westward development, the addition of states to the Union, to the West, definitely played a role in the development of Americans' image of themselves. Now we get back to the frontier myth, right? You can see where when you talk about this idea of the development of American nationalism, because all nationalisms are mythological in a sense. I think that's a true statement. That there's, look at the way we worship our founding fathers, right? Capital F, founding fathers. Mythological human beings, almost. So, again, the frontier thesis of American history by Frederick Jackson Turner, and then the frontier myth, I think are very important concepts in American history. And what I like about them is that you can still, I got Sling TV, and one of the channels is a channel that shows westerns, Western movies, or Western series all the time. And it's like a return to my youth, but it's like, there it is. Now again, the Western is gone out of style, unless when you think about detectives and spacemen. But I can still see the frontier myth very much influencing American culture today. I mean, when you think about January 6th, the storming of the Capitol, I'm sure that most of those people who are storming the Capitol, think of themselves as the inheritors of the cowboys or the Minutemen. I mean, I think that sort of the way most of them present themselves is straight frontier myth to me. It's still around, for good or for bad, right?